The beginning of a mysterious disappearance in America. The story that would send shockwaves across the nation unfolded in the late spring of 1984, in a quiet suburb of Allentown, Pennsylvania. Allentown, with its tree-lined streets, white picket fences, and the serene hum of quotidian American life, seemed the least likely setting for a mystery that would haunt the country for decades. Rebecca Miller, freshly 18 and balancing on the cusp between adolescence and adulthood, vanished without leaving so much as a trace. The Miller household, a stately two-story colonial with a well-manicured lawn, was typically bustling with the laughter and squabbles of 6 kids. But on the evening of May 17th, a gut-wrenching dread swept over the family when Rebecca failed to come home for dinner. She hadn't taken any belongings nor left a note. Her wallet, a diary with a pressed blue flower, and her schoolbooks were all in their places. Her mother, Martha, tried to convince herself that her daughter was simply at a friend's house too late. But as the hours dragged by, anxiety began mounting in the Miller home. An hour past Rebecca's curfew, her father Daniel called every friend whose number he could find in the battered family address book. None of them had seen or heard from Rebecca since school let out. Daniel's voice, normally deep and steady, sounded cracked as he called the Allentown police just after 10 p.m. The police responded quickly, but there was little to go on. No footprints, no threatening letters, no witnesses. Rebecca had last been seen walking along Oakwood Lane carrying her backpack, her blonde hair pulled into a loose braid as she chatted with an acquaintance. Beyond that, it was as if she'd simply evaporated into thin air. The Miller family's tight-knit Quaker community rallied around them. They organized search parties, plastered flyers at every supermarket and gas station within a 10-mile radius, and made emotional pleas on local radio stations for any information about the missing girl. The initial investigation unearthed few clues. There was no evidence of a struggle along her route home, and the neighbors hadn't noticed anything unusual. No strange vehicles, no unfamiliar faces. For weeks, volunteers combed the fields and woods on the outskirts of town, prodding through dense thickets and peering into culverts, calling Rebecca's name until their voices grew hoarse. Her case, though taken seriously by local authorities, began to cool as the weeks dragged into months. Detectives interviewed her family, friends, and teachers. Some friends hinted that Rebecca had seemed down in recent months, more withdrawn than usual, but there had been no overt signs she had planned to leave or hurt herself. Her grades at the local high school had slipped, but the guidance counselor chalked it up to standard teen existential angst. In the absence of any real leads, speculation ran rampant. Had she run away with a boyfriend? Been the victim of a serial predator passing through? Or was her disappearance connected, as some whispered late at night, to the strict and sometimes odd behavior inside the Miller household? The Millers clung to hope, but as months turned into years, the pain dulled but didn't disappear. The Allentown Police Department filed Rebecca's case away, unsolved, another face fading into the ever-expanding roster of missing teenagers from America's heartland. But in 1984, none could have imagined that this suburban mystery would linger in dark corners of their collective subconscious for nearly a quarter century, or that the truth, when it finally surfaced, would shake the very foundations of what they thought they knew about their neighbors, and about the limits of human cruelty and endurance. A shocking reappearance after 24 years. It was a rain-soaked spring day in 2008, a day that seemed unremarkable in the bustling city of Philadelphia, until seemingly out of nowhere, the past came crashing into the present in the most unimaginable way. At St. Mark's Hospital, doctors and nurses were jolted into crisis mode when the emergency room was thrown into chaos by the arrival of a barely conscious young woman. She was extremely pale, with hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, and long hair so overgrown it tumbled in uneven clumps around her face. Dressed in an oversized, threadbare sweater and faded jeans, she exuded an air of having been hidden far from the world for much too long. When the paramedics had picked her up, there was no ID, no purse, nothing but a few handwritten notes in a fragile, unfamiliar handwriting clutched tightly in her fist. Her body told its own story. She was dangerously malnourished, her skin marred with old scars and telltale bruises, her limbs weak as if unused over years. Lab tests swiftly revealed a life lived in deprivation, chronic anemia, untreated epilepsy, kidney and respiratory complications. The hospital staff, seasoned and unflappable as they were, whispered their disbelief. Such severe neglect and medical trauma in 21st century America was almost unheard of. A man calling himself Thomas Green arrived at the hospital within the hour. Claiming to be the woman's maternal grandfather, he appeared anxious but evasive, unable to answer simple questions about her medical history or personal preferences. When pressed about her parents, Thomas repeated, almost by rote, that the woman's mother, Elizabeth Green, had gone missing decades before. Every detail he shared came across as practiced, incomplete, or in contradiction with what little could be inferred from the girl's notes and physical condition. He urged the doctors to treat her swiftly, then stalled or redirected any inquiry about her origins. The attending physician, Dr. Phillips, perplexed by this mystery patient's condition and the story provided, decided to alert the authorities. The absence of any records, medical or legal, for the girl, who seemed to be about 19 or 20, was itself a red flag. Police officers arrived, quietly taking statements and beginning the painstaking process of piecing together clues. As the hospital workers tried desperately to stabilize the patient, a growing sense of unease took hold. Somewhere, a family's darkest secrets were unraveling under the fluorescent lights of the emergency ward. Meanwhile, detectives trawled through missing persons databases and cold case files. Deep in the dusty archives, they stumbled on something uncanny. The woman's physical resemblance, down to the shade of her hair and the shape of her chin, matched an age progression composite for Rebecca Miller, the teenager who had vanished from a quiet Allentown suburb a full 24 years earlier. The infamous case, long thought unsolvable, was suddenly thrust back into the harsh glare of public scrutiny. As news of the unidentified patient with no past began to quietly ripple through police channels and later the media, the Miller family was contacted for the first time in years. Calls from law enforcement reawakened a pain they had for decades forced themselves to bury. Was it possible, after all this time, that the mystery that had haunted them could finally be answered? Was this fragile, broken woman the same girl they lost to the night so many years before? Within days, this one emergency room visit had blown open doors that had lain closed for nearly a generation, exposing wounds, igniting speculation, and setting off a chain of events that would soon mesmerize and horrify the nation. The launch of the investigation. The sudden appearance of the unidentified young woman at St. Mark's Hospital in Philadelphia sent shockwaves through the quiet corridors of local law enforcement. By the time detectives arrived, the facility's atmosphere had shifted from an ordinary day to one tinged with suspense and uncertainty. Officers were immediately struck by the gravity of her condition. The unmistakable signs of long-term deprivation and trauma were etched into her appearance, down to the smallest details: her frail frame, her defensive posture, and the haunted look lingering in her eyes. With no identification, no medical records, and conflicting information from the anxious man claiming to be her grandfather, the police knew this case was anything but routine. The initial steps were methodical and cautious. Officers photographed and fingerprinted the young woman in hopes of matching her identity to any existing records. She lay silent, barely responsive, clutching only a handful of crumpled notes that offered little clarity. Some scribbled with what looked like desperate pleas or fragments of memories, others simply incoherent. These, too, were carefully logged as evidence. Every detail felt eerily significant. Detectives interviewed hospital staff, EMTs who brought the girl in, and the stranger who called himself Thomas Green. His answers raised more questions than they answered. He seemed hazy on precise dates, stumbled over familial details, and was evasive or defensive whenever pressed. Suspicion rippled through the investigators. Was he hiding past abuse? Was there an active threat to this young woman, or someone else? Working through the night, police created a timeline of her arrival and painstakingly traced the ambulance's route backward, checking security camera footage from gas stations and traffic lights across the city. Their best hope lay in the missing persons databases. It took hours of coordination between local agencies, the state's cold case division, and even a call to the FBI for technical help in facial recognition. Detectives compared photographs of the unidentified woman to age progression images of missing girls nationwide. At dawn, a hushed excitement ran through the precinct. The facial structure, hair color, and certain unique features almost perfectly lined up with Rebecca Miller, missing from Allentown since 1984. This thunderbolt revelation reignited a file that had sat cold for 24 years. Officers drove to Allentown to alert the local department and, crucially, reach out to the Miller family. Meanwhile, the news was carefully kept under wraps as Pennsylvania State Police and the FBI began planning the next steps, verifying her identity by DNA, reconstructing her likely movements over 2 decades, and quietly interviewing possible witnesses, both new and old. The hospital's psychiatric team was called in to assess the young woman's mental state. Her condition veered between catatonic withdrawal and panicked confusion, suggesting years of profound trauma. Detectives were briefed on how to interact with her gently, at a pace she could tolerate. For the first time in a generation, the darkest chapter in the Miller family's history teetered on the edge of being rewritten. As the investigation shifted from medical crisis mode to a full-scale criminal inquiry, the seeds of long-buried secrets began to crack open, promising both painful answers and a reckoning decades in the making. Rebecca Miller, the quiet daughter of the American suburbs. From the outside looking in, Rebecca Miller was the very picture of the all-American girl, sun-kissed blonde hair, a slender figure from years of running cross-country, and soft blue eyes that often seemed lost in thought. Yet beneath that wholesome exterior, Rebecca was a study in isolation, a young woman whose silent struggles went largely unnoticed by those around her. Rebecca grew up as the middle child in a bustling family of 6 siblings, each with larger-than-life personalities that tended to overshadow her quiet presence. Their house, nestled on a leafy street in a close-knit Pennsylvania suburb, was always alive with the noise of siblings arguing, a TV droning in the background, and her mother bustling from room to room. In that chaos, Rebecca often faded into the periphery, preferring the company of her books and the comfort of her small bedroom above the garage. To her classmates and teachers at Allentown High, Rebecca was polite, reserved, and just a little mysterious. She rarely volunteered answers in class, but her written work displayed a fierce intelligence. Teachers would sometimes leave notes of encouragement on her papers, urging her to participate more, but she shied away from the limelight. Her friendships, few and far between, were mostly with fellow outcasts. She cherished long, meandering walks with her best friend Lydia, through the quiet woods at the edge of town, where the pressure of school and home seemed to melt away. Yet Rebecca's inner world was anything but peaceful. Despite her gentle demeanor, she carried a weighty sadness that neither her friends nor her family could truly understand. As she drifted further into adolescence, her mood seemed to darken. She smiled less. Report cards, once full of A's and glowing comments, slowly gave way to B's and C's. Her mother, worried by Rebecca's waning motivation, would confront her about her grades, but Rebecca typically met these concerns with silence or a mumbled apology. Some afternoons, Rebecca would sit at her bedroom window and stare for hours at the street below, lost in thoughts that she kept fiercely guarded. Sometimes she filled her journal with prose and poetry, sometimes hopeful, sometimes desperate. Scrawled between the lines were subtle cries for help, but no one in her family thought to read between those lines. The Millers weren't the sort to talk about feelings, and Rebecca, out of habit or necessity, learned to keep hers hidden. Rumors swirled on occasion. Was Rebecca depressed? Did she have a boyfriend her parents didn't know about? Was her quiet nature just shyness, or something more troubling? When 2 years before her disappearance, she briefly ran away with a friend. It sent a ripple of shock through the neighborhood, but she returned in less than a week, frazzled but unharmed. No clear explanation ever came forth, leaving most to chalk it up to youthful rebellion rather than a sign of deeper trouble. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Rebecca grew even more withdrawn. She skipped after-school events, stopped answering Lydia's phone calls, and spent more time wandering alone. Old friends noted how the sparkle had left her eyes, and parents at her church sent up silent prayers for the struggling girl they saw, but never really knew. Looking back with hindsight sharpened by tragedy, those who knew Rebecca realized just how many warning signs had gone unheeded. What began as innocent introversion had gradually deepened into something much darker, but cloaked in the mundane routines of suburban life, her suffering remained invisible until the day she vanished without a trace, leaving behind only silence and unanswered questions. The Miller family. Ordinary outside, dark inside. On the surface, the Miller family embodied the American suburban dream. Their home, a stately 2-story colonial with red shutters and a sprawling green lawn, was nestled on a tree-lined street filled with kids riding bikes and the distant sounds of barbecues and lawnmowers. Daniel Miller, the patriarch, was a respected structural engineer known for attending community meetings and volunteering at church events. Martha Miller, the matriarch, was always seen bustling to and from the grocery store, helping out at the local school and tending to her garden overflowing with peonies. To the neighbors, the Millers seemed like a textbook example of family harmony, raising 6 children with apparent devotion and old-fashioned care. Yet behind closed doors, a relentless atmosphere of unease simmered. Daniel, despite his smiling public persona, ruled the household with a rigidity that bordered on tyrannical. He dictated even the smallest details: bedtimes, meal plans, what books were suitable, and which friends could visit. His expectations for discipline left his children perpetually on edge, constantly striving for approval but rarely feeling they achieved it. The children, especially the older ones, learned to move through the house silently, careful not to spark their father's temper. Laughter was often stifled. Disagreements were swiftly suppressed. Martha, while loving in her own way, seemed cowed by her husband's presence. She spent much of her days tiptoeing around Daniel's moods, cleaning up after tense moments or smoothing over his cutting remarks with gentle words. To outsiders, she was gracious and welcoming, but inside the home, she appeared tired, her eyes shadowed by an anxiety she never acknowledged aloud. The siblings' dynamic was equally complicated. The oldest, Aaron, sought to shield his younger brothers and sisters from their father's worst outbursts, accepting more chores and responsibility than any teenage boy should. The youngest, little Ellie, was often babied and protected by the older children. But in this house, Rebecca, ever the quiet one, withdrew further into herself, both from the noise and from the sense of danger that pervaded the air, even without stormy arguments or physical blows that left visible marks. While Daniel prided himself on the family's outward image, straight-A report cards, matching Christmas sweaters, and polite children, there was a chill to his love, tightly wound up in control and secrecy. When someone failed to meet his standards, his disappointment was palpable and suffocating. Punishments could be severe, though rarely physical. Often it was the threat of isolation, cutting off privileges, or sharp, humiliating lectures that left lasting scars. Many neighbors in retrospect confessed to occasionally sensing a strange tension in the Miller household, a stiffness in Daniel's posture, the way Martha's smile never quite reached her eyes, children who watched adults a little too closely when they thought no one was looking. But in suburban America, where facades are meticulously guarded, few dared to question what really happened when the doors shut and the curtains were drawn. In this environment, fear and repression replaced warmth, and while nothing about the Millers' carefully curated exterior betrayed the truth, the seeds of tragedy were quietly taking root just beneath the surface. Police suspicion and the mysterious letter. The investigation into Rebecca Miller's disappearance had begun to stall when an unassuming envelope arrived at the Allentown Police Department several days after her family reported her missing. The letter was addressed simply to the Miller family in neat, unfamiliar cursive. On first inspection, it appeared to be from Rebecca herself. At least, that's what the signature at the bottom suggested. Yet from the outset, there were aspects of the document that set everyone on edge. The content of the letter was brief and oddly formal, as though written under duress or by someone trying too hard to imitate Rebecca's voice. It claimed she had found a new spiritual family, and urged her parents and siblings not to search for her, promising that she was safe and at peace with her decision. The text contained vague religious references, mentioning a calling she could not ignore, and describing her departure as a journey of the soul. It was signed with her full name, Rebecca Ann Miller, a detail her closest friends found strange, as she always signed notes as simply Becca. Detectives were immediately skeptical. The phrasing and tone did not match Rebecca's usual correspondence, which they cross-referenced using samples from her school assignments and personal notes. Her closest friend Lydia was adamant. Becca would never write like this. She didn't even believe in all that stuff. The Miller family, desperate for any sign or explanation, handed over a number of her journals and letters for comparison. The police called in a handwriting expert, who concluded only that the writing was consistent with Rebecca's hand, but introduced enough ambiguity to keep suspicions alive. There was a certain restraint to the penmanship, as if it was composed under pressure or during a period of distress. Meanwhile, the community's reaction to the letter was split. Some neighbors latched onto the hope that Rebecca had chosen a new life rather than meeting with misfortune. Local pastors speculated if she had joined a religious commune, noting the region's patchwork of obscure sects and offshoots. Others whispered that the letter was an obvious fabrication, possibly an attempt by the Millers themselves to control the narrative or cover up some hidden family scandal. The police, for their part, refused to accept the note at face value. They considered a range of possibilities. Had Rebecca indeed run away? Was she coerced by someone into leaving, or worse, into composing the letter? Or was the letter simply planted to divert the investigation, by a stranger, a family member, or someone else altogether? Suspicion, heavy as humid summer air, settled over the Miller household. Officers began conducting unannounced visits looking for signs of further deception. Forensic analysis of the envelope itself yielded no prints but did reveal a postmark from the next town over. Detectives combed through traffic camera footage and bus terminal logs, searching for evidence that Rebecca had traveled on her own. These leads, however, went nowhere. No witnesses recalled seeing her, and no tickets matching her profile were purchased during the relevant window. Investigators even contacted groups in neighboring states known for recruiting vulnerable youths into closed, isolated communities. They distributed flyers and circulated her photograph at local shelters, churches, and even unconventional religious gatherings. Despite their efforts, no further credible sightings or communications surfaced. The letter remained a chilling anomaly, a message that provided neither relief nor closure but instead deepened the growing sense of mystery and distrust. The double life of a father and hidden secrets. Outwardly, Daniel Miller presented himself as an almost archetypal figure of American paternal respectability, a man with a firm handshake, a crisp dress shirt, and a ready smile for neighbors and colleagues alike. He graced church gatherings with quiet authority, showed up for every school open house, and was frequently praised for his dedication to both work and family. Yet, as with so many facades cultivated in polite suburban society, the truth lurking behind Daniel's controlled demeanor was far darker and infinitely more disturbing than anyone around him could have imagined. To the world, Daniel was a man of unwavering morals and discipline, clearly devoted to the well-being of his children. However, inside the Miller household, a different Daniel reigned, one whose discipline crossed the border into domination, whose expectations of obedience left no room for questions or individuality. The children, especially Rebecca, learned early on to read the signs of their father's shifting moods, the tightness of his jaw, the curt edge in his voice, the way he'd tap his knuckles on the dinner table if displeased. All warning bells signaling that the house would be shrouded in anxiety until he deemed the balance restored. While all 6 Miller children felt the constant pressure to meet his impossible standards, Daniel always seemed to reserve a special intensity for Rebecca. In his eyes, she needed protecting from the world and herself, but that protection quickly became invasive control. She was forbidden from attending sleepovers, her diary was routinely read without permission, and Daniel questioned her about every friend, every after-school activity, any variation from the schedule he set, arriving home 10 minutes late from school, spending too long in the shower. Even the tone in which she replied could trigger one of his infamous lectures or worse, extended silent treatments that left the family unnerved for days. It was not simply the rigidity that marked Daniel's rule, but the omnipresent sense that there were invisible lines one must never cross. He discouraged his children from sharing anything about their lives with outsiders. "What happens in this family stays in this family," he'd intone, a mantra drilled in with chilling effect. If rules were broken, punishments could be unpredictable. Sometimes it was a revoked privilege, sometimes it was public humiliation within the house, sometimes it was inexplicable isolation from siblings. The house became Daniel's stage, each family member a reluctant actor following a script they'd learned by heart. Strangely, Daniel's authoritarian behavior wasn't always overtly aggressive. In public, he was gentleness itself, quick to help a neighbor or attend a school play. Colleagues spoke highly of his work ethic and generosity, describing a man quick to offer advice or lend a hand. No one saw the tightly wound anxiety he left behind at home. No one saw the way his presence made the air feel heavier, the walls closer, the children smaller and more careful in their words and actions. For Rebecca, Daniel's watchfulness bordered on obsession. As she moved through adolescence, he doubled down on restrictions. She was prohibited from having unsupervised phone calls, exposed to repeated interrogations about her interests and friends. He monitored her mail, took away her music for infractions he alone determined, and made it clear that no boy, friend or otherwise, was allowed near. Publicly, he explained these as measures to keep her safe in a world full of dangers, but in private, the message was simple: trust no one but him, obey his rules without question, and keep her world as small as possible. The rest of the Miller family adapted to this tyranny with varying degrees of resignation or fear. Martha, Daniel's wife, tiptoed around his moods, acting as peacemaker and buffer for the worst of his anger. The children sought what solidarity they could, but it was always colored by the knowledge that at any moment, one of them could become the focus of their father's next campaign of discipline or suspicion. Over the years, the dynamic at home grew less about love and more about survival, keeping quiet, drawing as little attention as possible, and learning to suppress feelings that risked erupting into chaos. Beneath this landscape of fear, Daniel concealed even greater secrets. His knowledge of construction, so admired by colleagues, enabled him to create hidden spaces within the house, places no outsider would have thought to look. According to later investigations, these modifications began subtly: additional locks, concealed doors, strange renovations that Daniel insisted were for safety or privacy. No one in the neighborhood suspected a thing, and to the Miller children, these measures were merely another edict from their father, who they had long since stopped questioning. Daniel's dual existence was a masterclass in manipulation. He kept his co-workers at arm's length, rarely socializing outside of prescribed work hours. He discouraged friendships that might dig too deeply, favoring acquaintances who admired his professionalism but knew little about his private life. Any suggestion from a family member of confiding in a teacher or counselor was met with icy resistance and harsh warnings of retribution. Over time, this atmosphere of secrecy became nearly absolute, a cocoon that shielded Daniel's growing paranoia and darkness from the scrutiny of the outside world. Within the four walls of the Miller home, Rebecca became the principal victim of Daniel's tightening grip. Subtle at first, a restriction here, a suggestion there, it soon became clear that her father's involvement in her life was not just about keeping her in line, but about isolating her entirely. The sense of security that the neighborhood's leafy streets projected was, for the Millers, a cruel illusion. The real story was one of suffocating fear, suppressed voices, and a family living at the mercy of a man whose devotion to perfection hid a heart frozen by control and secrecy. The Underground Bunker, and 24 Years of Hell. Beneath the neat colonial house and blooming gardens of the Miller property, darkness festered quite literally underground. In the early 1980s, Daniel Miller had undertaken what he called a basement improvement project, a feat explained to curious neighbors as a way to create additional storage, perhaps even a wine cellar or a private workspace. Only Daniel, skilled in the art of construction and secrecy, knew the true purpose of his meticulous project: a concealed underground chamber, hidden behind layers of drywall and false paneling, accessible only by a camouflaged hatch accessible from the mechanical room. The actual space was a chilling contradiction to the pristine domesticity upstairs. Measuring scarcely 12 feet by 8, the chamber had ceilings low enough to force an adult to stoop. The cinderblock walls sweat with condensation through Pennsylvania's clammy winters and humid summers. Daniel soundproofed the perimeter thoroughly, insulating with thrift store carpeting and old mattresses, a sinister trick to trap any noise while muffling the cries that might have, in another world, signaled a desperate plea for help. Inside this tomb, Rebecca came to exist on the other side of normal life, as invisible as a ghost. The cell was spare: a thin foam mattress on the floor, a battered bookshelf with a handful of old novels, a rickety lamp. There were no windows, a bucket served for her sanitation. Meals, stale sandwiches, cans of soup, sloshing plastic bottles of water, were left on a metal plate by the hatch, delivered whenever Daniel deemed appropriate. Sometimes he visited daily. Other times she would go long, endless hours with only the silence and the relentless ticking pipes overhead for company. Her sense of time, at first marked by meticulous tallies scratched into the wall, eventually evaporated in the permanent darkness. Rebecca's only contact with the outside world was Daniel, her captor, and the only voice she heard for years at a time. He brought books, sporadically, sometimes ripped from charity bins or garage sales, but otherwise discouraged curiosity about the world above. When he spoke, it was often an odd mixture of apology, warning, and insidious affection, a twisted rationalization for his crimes. At times he would assure her that the world outside was too dangerous, that no one would understand, that only he could keep her safe. As months bled into years, the monotony and trauma gnawed at Rebecca's mind. Days blurred, she lost track of seasons and sometimes forgot her own age. The boredom was suffocating, but it was the unpredictability of Daniel's moods, a sudden rage, a sullen withdrawal, an unexpected moment of forced tenderness, that kept Rebecca living on edge. Every footstep on the unfinished stairs overhead felt like the omen of terror. Every time the hatch creaked open, she didn't know if it was for a meal, a warning, or another ordeal more unbearable than hunger or cold. Occasionally Daniel's obsession with control manifested in bizarre ways. Tests of Rebecca's obedience, demanding she recite prayers, answer complex riddles, or reenact traumatic moments for his macabre satisfaction, punishments that ranged from hours of total darkness to isolation weeks on end. He would interrogate her about memories she wanted to forget, berating any hint of defiance, and then suddenly switch to plaintive confessions about his own childhood miseries, as if seeking validation or forgiveness from his victim. Rebecca's physical health ebbed precariously. There were periods of untreated illness and chronic malnutrition. Injuries sometimes festered for weeks before Daniel, faced with their severity, would reluctantly bring bandages or medicine, always setting strict rules for how, when, or if she could access care. She experienced the world through gaps, snippets of radio when Daniel was feeling merciful, rare glimpses of sunlight when the hatch opened at midday, or the distant laughter of her siblings living freely just a floor above her prison. There was no clock, no calendar, nothing to mark holidays except the fleeting hope inspired by the scent of pine, or the sound of fireworks muffled by layers of earth and concrete. Rebecca, forced into such isolation, developed rituals of survival, reciting lines of poetry, singing softly to herself, inventing elaborate fantasies of escape or rescue. She tried to keep her mind sharp, to stay tethered to memory, but the solitude bred hallucinations and dread. In her diary, where she scrawled whenever Daniel permitted, Rebecca expressed a longing not just for freedom, but for any kind of touch, comfort, or proof that she still existed to others beneath the surface. Over time, Daniel's explanations for keeping her hidden grew more elaborate and paranoid. He insisted that the authorities hated her, that strangers outside would only exploit or harm her, that even her own family had forgotten she existed. In the face of constant psychological manipulation, Rebecca's willpower flickered, sometimes burning with hope, other times nearly extinguished. The horror of living underground intensified year after year. With each passing season, Daniel refined his system. Sometimes he'd block the vents to deny her fresh air as punishment, or change the lighting schedule to keep her in perpetual night or blinding fluorescence. On rare occasions, perhaps on a birthday or after one of his religious fits, he brought her trinkets or small luxuries, a comb, a faded photograph, or a battered paperback. These gestures, rather than providing comfort, only deepened the bewildering cruelty of her existence, highlighting the vast gulf between normalcy and her reality. What made the ordeal more unbearable was the knowledge that life above ground continued undisturbed. Rebecca would hear echoes, snippets of her siblings' voices, the scratchy sound of the family TV, holiday music, or heated arguments. These muffled reminders were constant torture, proof that she was so close yet devastatingly alone. Sometimes, she dreamed of screaming loud enough to fracture the concrete, to shatter Daniel's carefully constructed world and break the spell of silence that bound her. But Daniel was always vigilant. He checked every bolt, tested the soundproofing, and threatened disaster if she drew attention. He claimed that her rescue would mean suffering for the whole family, that police would never believe her side, that she bore some fault for her captivity. The rules mutated. Compliance was sometimes rewarded, sometimes not. Defiance always brought swift consequences. Daniel's twisted affection and cruelty became the only constants. Rebecca was systematically robbed of agency, left to create meaning from scraps. She interacted with the world solely through the perspective Daniel allowed or invented. On occasion, he would recount news from outside, often warped to support his narrative or the illusion that her exile was carefully chosen for her protection. He weaponized her longing for connection against her, making her believe any hope of escape was impossible, unthinkable, or catastrophic for those she loved. There were periods of rebellion, silent refusals to eat, sullen withdrawal, angry outbursts. Each act of resistance was met by Daniel's rage, followed by renewed isolation or physical punishment. Rebecca learned quickly that survival depended upon a delicate balance, just enough obedience to keep his anger at bay, but enough resistance to preserve some shred of her true self. The psychological toll was incalculable. Anxiety, depression, panic attacks, and a persistent sense of unreality became her steady companions. The physical environment was its own torment. The damp air bred mold and sickness. Rebecca suffered from respiratory infections, rashes, untreated wounds. Sometimes rodents or insects invaded. The threat of flooding during heavy storms loomed. At times the power failed and she was left in suffocating darkness, counting her breaths in terror until electricity returned. Even the muted rhythm of the house above could jolt her nerves, her senses sharpened unnaturally by years of vigilant listening for any change, any hope, or any disaster. Everything was dictated by Daniel's timetable, the very seasons of her interior world set by when he allowed contact, conversation, or occasional tokens of false kindness. On days he was gone for extended periods, paranoia took hold. Was he finally leaving her to die? Would she ever see another human face? Would someone discover her? Or would her body become part of the very foundation of the Miller home, another secret sealed behind painted walls and polite smiles? Despite unspeakable suffering, Rebecca fought to retain slivers of hope. She clung to memories, her mother's laugh, the scent of meadow grass, the feeling of wind on her face. She tried to reconstruct past conversations, replaying and rewriting them in her mind. Sometimes, when she thought she could bear no more, she turned to the battered notebook Daniel unwittingly allowed her, recording secret messages, stories, and the slow, poetic testimony of her pain. This small act became her resistance, her proof that her mind and voice could survive, even as her body and spirit frayed under the weight of years spent entombed just beneath her own lost life. As the years stacked one upon another, Rebecca's resilience became a paradox, both her salvation and her curse. She began to recognize the patterns of Daniel's behavior, learning to anticipate his moods and build subtle strategies for self-preservation. At times, she attempted to negotiate for minor privileges, a few extra minutes of light, different books, vague promises about the possibility of seeing her family again. She weighed every word, every expression, careful never to betray outright resistance, for fear of eliciting his wrath. The psychological manipulation Daniel wielded escalated over time. He convinced Rebecca that her absence had destroyed the family's peace, that her siblings hated her for the turmoil she'd caused, and that her mother was either dead or had willfully moved on. These lies, repeated endlessly and punctuated by periods of total silence, corroded Rebecca's sense of reality. Eventually, she doubted the evidence of her own memory and the possibility of rescue. Daniel's dual identity outside shielded him from suspicion, and his skill at masking his tracks made hope seem like a dangerous fantasy. Sometimes Daniel brought items from the outside world that suggested time's relentless passage, holiday decor, discarded magazines months out of date, or children's art projects that looked achingly familiar. In those moments, Rebecca confronted the reality of years lost, of birthdays unmarked, and the slow fading of the world that had once belonged to her. The anniversary of her captivity began to lose meaning. All time was measured now only by Daniel's sporadic appearances, the aching loneliness and brief interludes of sensory experience. There were faint, almost imperceptible shifts in Rebecca's determination. She fantasized daily about somehow escaping, deciphering the mechanics of the lock, or perhaps leaving clues for someone to discover her. Yet Daniel's paranoia made such thoughts perilous. Each hint of her will was met with renewed caution, strict surveillance, and the constant threat against her life should she bring ruin on the household. Rebecca's survival instincts sharpened in the most unexpected ways. She noted everything about her environment, cataloged sounds, changes in Daniel's appearance, even the rhythm of the pipes overhead. She clung to every sliver of humanity available to her, keeping her sense of self alive through writing, recitation, prayer, and inventing whole worlds behind her closed eyes. When Daniel was in one of his unpredictable rages, she reminded herself that by staying alive even in the smallest of ways, she preserved the possibility, however faint, of one day emerging from the darkness. In the rarest moments, sometimes in dreams or in the liminal state between waking and sleeping, Rebecca caught glimpses of herself as she'd once been, strong-willed and curious, a child with hope. These memories acted as both comfort and torment, a reminder of those better days, and a beacon that rejected total despair. For 24 years, the hidden cellar beneath the Miller home was both the site of Rebecca's unimaginable torment and a crucible in which she forged a defiant, if battered, hope. That, against all odds and logic, is what would one day help her survive. The children in the basement and the continuing tragedy. From the darkness of the hidden cellar, a tragedy multiplied itself far beyond the grim reality of Rebecca's solo captivity. In the suffocating shadows below the Miller house, not only was she stripped of her own autonomy and hope, she bore and was forced to raise multiple children, each a devastating testament to her perpetrator's cruelty. These children, products of violence and secrecy, grew up knowing neither a world of freedom nor the warmth of genuine family, but rather the claustrophobic and surreal existence ruled by Daniel's will. Rebecca's pregnancies were shrouded in secrecy and marked by horror. She had little to no medical attention. Daniel, terrified of discovery, invented ad hoc rules for prenatal and postnatal care, scavenging supplies from drugstores or borrowing items from unsuspecting neighbors. He was the self-appointed authority on everything, from delivery to naming. Rebecca endured labor alone on the cold floor, biting on makeshift rags to muffle her cries, praying her children would survive the appallingly unsanitary conditions. Some lived, some, heartbreakingly, did not. Their tiny lives flickering and fading out in the darkness before ever reaching the world above. The living children each bore the marks, physical, emotional, and psychological, of unimaginable deprivation. Daniel's paranoid worldview manifested in how he raised them. For the first children, he sometimes allowed them brief, strictly supervised forays into the upstairs world, when he could pass them off as his distant relatives or foster kids. The neighbors, seeing a tired man suddenly responsible for new little faces, offered awkward sympathy. They never suspected the real horror that lay just beneath their feet. But the children who remained with their mother in the cellar lived lives defined by darkness, silence, and suffocating fear. They were never taken outdoors, never attended school, never met anyone outside of their tiny, hidden universe. Their world was shaped by the flickering glow of a bare light bulb and the stories Rebecca clung to from memory, fairy tales, poems, and snatches of songs. Amid constant scarcity and the unpredictable moods of their jailer, Rebecca became their sole teacher, comforter, and protector. She tried to teach them fragments of hope and decency amid their grim reality, inventing rituals and games to distract from hunger and fear. For these children, questions of identity were both urgent and impossible. Daniel fed them a carefully constructed web of lies, that the world above was full of threats, that rescue was a dangerous fantasy, that their suffering was evidence of their own specialness rather than his sickness. He sometimes permitted them a battered, warped radio or a pile of worn books, never more than he could monitor, always with the warning that discovery would spell disaster for them all. The children grew up in an eerie choreography of survival and enforced secrecy, whispering in corners, listening for the threat of footsteps, learning early to submerge any outward sign of resistance or hope. Their mother's struggle to keep their imaginations alive was an act of rebellion as much as love. Relationship dynamics within this bizarre underground family were tender and tragic. The older children often tried to absorb the brunt of Daniel's volatility, shielding younger siblings from his unpredictable shifts between chilling tenderness and rage. Elizabeth, the oldest daughter born below ground, quickly learned to calm the smaller ones with lullabies and gentle stories. The boys grew wary, learning to sense their grandfather's moods, sometimes competing for his rare moments of praise, but more often drawing together in shared desperation. Each child's personality, whether shy and withdrawn, quick and sharp-tongued, or wildly imaginative, was shaped not only by genetic legacy, but by the unique traumas and brief respites carved from the darkness. Medical problems were frequent and profoundly dangerous. Malnutrition, untreated fevers, and the risks of living in a moldy, poorly ventilated space resulted in recurring illnesses. Daniel, obsessed with control but unskilled in caregiving, often made things worse. Home remedies brought more harm than comfort. Infections sometimes went untreated for weeks. Rebecca, left to improvise with what little she had, grieved deeply every time one of her children suffered, blaming herself when she could not protect them. The children, ever hungry for both food and affection, developed elaborate routines for coaxing comfort from one another and their mother, a secret language of love in an environment built for hiding pain. Occasionally, Daniel's paranoia would force him to separate the children, moving one or two upstairs under a new story, fostered grandchild, ward left behind by a struggling relative, always careful to invent records and strict rules about their silence. These upstairs children lived dual lives. Above, they learned to maintain the facade, repressing questions about their origins or the scraps of memory that suggested another world below. At night they might glimpse Daniel's moments of distraction or catch the muffled hint of a lullaby drifting from the vent, a reminder that someone was missing but unmentionable. Some of these children adapted to normalcy, excelling at school or making friends, but their sense of unease and fractured identity haunted them. Others never fully escaped the psychological gravity of the cellar. A part of them remained trapped, always listening for danger, always waiting for the truth to be revealed. The emotional legacy for these children was enormous. Growing up in an environment so deeply distorted meant that even their moments of happiness, shared jokes, brief games, secret confidences, were colored by fear. Their relationship with Rebecca was profound. Simultaneously mother, sister, and fellow prisoner, she became their anchor, her reserves of resilience both inspiring and heartbreaking. She tried to shield them from the brunt of Daniel's cruelty and manipulations, whispering comfort and hope when she could, strategizing to keep small comforts alive, and, above all, never succumbing to utter despair in their presence. The psychological effects became more apparent as the children grew older. Questions multiplied. Why couldn't they go outside? Why did Daniel have so many rules? Why did their family's story not match what they overheard on the rare occasions when the world above seeped in? Whispers became arguments, subtle acts of rebellion, refusing to cooperate with Daniel, risking a whisper or a note slipped between cracks, grew as the children tested boundaries. The emotional ecosystem became more complex with every passing year, as the children struggled toward autonomy, longing for escape, yet terrified of the unknown. Despite the relentless suffering, small victories became the threads of hope holding them together. Rebecca's determination to educate her children ended up being both survival strategy and subtle resistance. Some children learned to read from scraps of magazines, and they pieced together stories and songs with improvisational flair. In stolen moments of privacy, Rebecca would encourage them to dream, to remember the stars, to believe that kindness existed even in an unimaginable world. Yet the cycle of abuse, secrecy, and trauma proved nearly impossible to break on their own. Daniel's power came from total isolation, emotional manipulation, and the gaslighting that convinced his children and grandchildren alike that they were misfits who did not belong anywhere else. When sickness, rebellion, or growing desperation brought the outside world closer to discovering the truth, culminating in the desperate moments when a dangerously ill child forced Daniel's hand, ultimately unraveling the whole house of lies, the suffering and resilience of these children stood as awful testimony to decades of hidden crime. The collapse of defenses when the illness worsens. The unraveling of the Miller family's decades-long facade began in the most mundane and unassuming of ways, through the persistent, inescapable encroachment of illness. After nearly a quarter of a century maintaining an impenetrable double life, Daniel Miller encountered a predicament that brute discipline and secrecy alone could not solve. This single point of vulnerability would, in the end, shine the very light he had always most feared. One of the children, his own biological child and grandchild from the long years of hidden captivity, began to exhibit signs of severe and rapidly deteriorating health. In the subterranean confines where Daniel had controlled every aspect of their existence, medical emergencies had always been the stuff of nightmares. Minor injuries or sickness he managed with improvised ad hoc solutions, never daring to seek professional help lest anyone ask questions. He had become disturbingly adept at jury-rigged first aid, concocting medications from piecemeal supplies, and interpreting high fevers or wasting coughs as mere trials to be endured. For more than 2 decades this approach persisted, not because it succeeded, but because it had not yet needed to confront the kind of crisis that could kill, swiftly and publicly. This time, however, the symptoms were impossible to ignore. The child was suffering from what appeared to be a severe infection, perhaps pneumonia, perhaps meningitis. No one in the cellar could have known for sure. The boy's cough deepened, his skin grew waxy and gray, and he lost the ability to stand or even cry. Rebecca pleaded again and again, her voice raw and desperate. This was different, she begged. This was death, not just suffering. Even the other children, long accustomed to deprivation and fear, sobbed in corners, watching the boy slip further away from them beneath blankets already damp with fever sweat. Daniel's panic became visible for the first time in years. He paced for hours in the cramped upstairs, torn between the urge to maintain the charade and the dawning certainty that he was powerless in the face of nature's inescapable force. He shouted at Rebecca to be silent, berated the sick child to fight harder, but in truth his tightly controlled world was unraveling out from under his feet. The old threats, "If anyone outside knows, it's the end for us all," became hollow as the boy's breathing grew shallower, every wheeze echoing the countdown to catastrophe. At last, too late for comfort but not yet for consequence, Daniel made a decision he'd always sworn was unthinkable. He bundled the child, gaunt and shivering, into a threadbare coat and drove to the nearest hospital under cover of night. He rehearsed a story in his head again and again. This was a distant relative suddenly in his care, a ward from a broken family, or perhaps a neighbor's child. Any narrative that might buy him time and steer attention away from the hidden horrors at his home. When he finally spoke to the ER staff, his tale seemed suspicious from the start. He had no paperwork, no contact for the child's mother, could not answer basic questions about vaccinations or past doctors, and bristled under even routine inquiry. His carefully cultivated persona, a responsible, mild-mannered man, clashed badly with his obvious evasiveness. Doctors, alarmed by the severity and neglect evident in the child's condition, pressed Daniel for answers. They noted the boy's malnutrition, unfamiliarity with basic social cues, and odd, stunted speech. The hospital's triage team alerted social services as a matter of protocol, but a shiver of suspicion spread quietly among nurses and police liaisons. There was something far more sinister at play than a case of neglect. They knew the signs of trauma, recognized coded language in the boy's mutterings about the room downstairs and not being allowed outside. Medical staff, trained to detect patterns of abuse and familial secrecy, quickly escalated the matter beyond local authorities. Meanwhile, word began to trickle beyond emergency room walls, reaching social workers and, soon enough, Philadelphia law enforcement. It didn't take long for connections to be drawn between Daniel Miller's awkward explanations and the long-standing cold case that still haunted Pennsylvania's police bulletin boards. Rebecca Miller, vanished as a teenager, rumored to have run away to join a religious commune. Now, hospital security footage put Daniel and a pale, haunted young woman together, and other children with the same shock of blonde hair as Becca Miller. A flurry of phone calls within hours would set off a domino effect that unraveled years of secrecy. As Daniel was held for further questioning, investigators raced against time to obtain a warrant and coordinate a search of his otherwise unremarkable suburban home. The authorities arrived at dawn in unmarked cars, careful to avoid tipping him off. Once inside, the team immediately detected signs that something was terribly wrong. Evidence of recently used hidden passages, noise-damping panels in the basement, and the faint, unmistakable odor of urine and sickness. The discovery of the cellar was a moment as surreal as it was horrifying. Officers found Rebecca, gaunt, nearly unrecognizable, cowering with two of her children in the dim light. The air was heavy with fear, the walls covered in years of desperate etchings. As the police called paramedics and brought the family, blinking and shuddering, out of captivity, the paradox of the Miller household, prim and proper upstairs, unspeakable darkness below, was laid bare for the world. Media learned of the raid within hours. Helicopters circled overhead as reporters and camera crews assembled outside, desperate for a glimpse of the house of horrors that had been hiding in plain sight. The neighborhood was stunned. Neighbors wept, some in shame for never suspecting anything amiss, others in denial, unable to reconcile the friendly Daniel they knew with the monster described by law enforcement. Back at the hospital, as Rebecca and her children underwent urgent medical care, caseworkers and trauma counselors began the long, arduous process of piecing together their identities and histories. The scope of the abuse, physical, psychological, and medical, quickly became apparent. Daniel, meanwhile, alternated between rambling denials and icy silence, occasionally insisting on his innocence, but faltering as he was confronted with mounting evidence and the recovered diary entries of his own daughter. The collapse began with a cough, a fever, and a desperate plea for help. For the millions watching the story unfold in endless news broadcasts, the Miller case was a macabre reminder: evil can exist just beneath the polished veneer of ordinary life, kept alive only by routine, silence, and the power of unchecked secrecy. For Rebecca and her children, the shattering of their subterranean prison marked the start, not the end, of the world's reckoning with the true horror that had grown beneath the surface of suburbia. A chilling confession and historic sentence. Chilling confession and historic sentence. The moment Daniel Miller was separated from Rebecca and his children by law enforcement, nearly 3 decades of horror began the slow, painful process of being brought into the light. The ensuing hours peeled away every shred of the Miller patriarch's carefully manufactured normalcy, and the interrogation that followed became a turning point, not just for the family, but for everyone in the community and beyond who had believed in the facade of an upstanding neighbor, friend, and church elder. Daniel's composure did not falter immediately. When officers first sat him down in the sterile, echoing interview room, he insisted calmly that there was some kind of mistake. He spoke with the crisp confidence of someone used to authority and deference. To the untrained eye, he might have passed for a falsely accused man, reserved, quietly shocked, offended at the suggestion of wrongdoing. "I have nothing to hide," he intoned with rehearsed dignity, "and I want to cooperate fully." But evidence was already mounting, inexorable and damning. The children's medical and psychological states could not be explained away. Handwriting analysis, fingerprints, and found personal effects connected Rebecca to her own story of disappearance. Traces of bodily fluids, old scars, and years of untreated ailments mapped out chapters of ongoing abuse. Photographs of hidden rooms, forensic diagrams, and the battered artifacts of life underground were arrayed before Daniel as detectives methodically dismantled his narrative of innocence. Faced with the overwhelming details of the hidden cellar, the existence of children nobody else had ever met, and Rebecca's own fragmented, traumatized testimony, Daniel's stance began to shift. What started as righteous indignation soon turned brittle and defensive, his tone growing clipped and his gaze darting. He denied, then minimized. When confronted with each new piece of proof, he wove increasingly convoluted stories, first about protecting Rebecca from the world, then about religious visions, even about conspiracies that supposedly forced his hand. It took nearly 5 hours of relentless questioning, supported by skilled interviewers trained in unraveling pathological liars before the cracks gave way, and the monstrous reality was finally spoken aloud. Daniel's confession was cold, calculated, and at times shockingly devoid of emotion. He admitted to building the underground chamber for Rebecca's safety. He described with chilling pragmatism the ways he controlled her environment, limited her freedom, and justified his actions as necessary discipline. He confirmed, in a chilling monotone, the births of children in the cellar, averting his eyes as he acknowledged those who had died. When asked how he lived with these choices, Daniel spoke of obligation, religiosity, and his perception of the world as fundamentally threatening and corrupt. He stopped short of expressing true remorse, but the sheer volume of evidence rendered further lies useless. Rebecca's separate statement, and the notes she'd managed to keep hidden, provided further clarity. Her detailed, often heartbreaking recollections dismantled Daniel's defenses, striping away any remaining ambiguity about the years of torture, isolation, and manipulation. When faced with these truths, Daniel's demeanor shifted once more. Now confronted not with faceless accusations but with the lived agony of his own daughter and her children, he lapsed into sullen silence. The sense of power and control he'd cultivated for so long evaporated under the bright, unforgiving lights of the interrogation room. The trial, once the dust of confession had settled and formal charges pressed, became one of the most closely watched in state and national history. The community, still numb with shock, filled every available pew in the courthouse while hundreds waited outside. The press clustered in swarms, and every network devoted daily coverage to the revelations emerging from court documents and testimony. Prosecutors laid out a painstaking narrative of control, abuse, and premeditation. Every fact was corroborated by forensic evidence, expert testimony, and the harrowing stories of Rebecca and her surviving children. Medical professionals detailed the myriad injuries and neglect that bore silent witness to the hell that unfolded, undetected beneath the Miller home. Psychiatric experts described the psychological scars, complex PTSD, anxiety, dissociative symptoms, affecting every survivor. Friends and neighbors, racked by guilt and disbelief, testified about the subtle but persistent oddities in the Miller household that over years failed to raise alarms. Daniel's defense, citing delusions, religious mania, and an obsession with safety, failed to sway either the jury or a public desperate for justice. Not once did Daniel express genuine remorse in open court. He appeared in a variety of guises, sometimes stoic, sometimes irritable, sometimes rambling about divine justification. The only flicker of emotion came when confronted by the adult children who now refused even to meet his gaze. Rebecca's turn on the witness stand became the emotional centerpiece of the proceedings. With the support of trauma specialists, she recounted her years in the cellar with heartbreaking clarity, telling of failed escape attempts, her desperate efforts to shield her children, and the complex psychological warfare waged by her father. Her testimony was measured and dignified, but the pain and trauma was undeniable. The verdict, unsurprisingly, was delivered swiftly. Daniel Miller was found guilty of kidnapping, false imprisonment, aggravated sexual assault, child endangerment, murder by deprivation of necessary care, and a host of lesser-related offenses. The judge, moved by both the evidence and the suffering of the victims, imposed the maximum sentence allowable under the law, multiple consecutive life terms, without the possibility of parole. The sentencing hearing was a moment of catharsis and reckoning. Family members and survivors read victim impact statements, each one a raw testament to the lasting consequences of Daniel's unimaginable cruelty. For Rebecca and her children, The words spoken that day became the first public acknowledgement of the suffering they had endured, and a formal renunciation of Daniel's power over them. With Daniel behind bars and the Miller home forever tainted by the discoveries beneath its foundation, the community began the long, uneasy process of healing. The trial and conviction reverberated far beyond Allentown, sparking renewed awareness about hidden domestic abuse, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the necessity of vigilance in even the safest-seeming neighborhoods. Rebecca's willingness to speak out, even through unimaginable pain, served as both an indictment of her father's crimes and a beacon of hope for survivors everywhere, a reminder that, however deeply buried, the truth can still come to light. Consequences and journey of survival for victims. Emerging from unimaginable darkness, the survivors of the Miller house were thrust into a world that felt both overwhelming and alien. 24 years of captivity, secrecy, and abuse had altered every cell of their being, not just physically but deep within their minds and spirits. Their journey toward recovery was labyrinthine, complex, unpredictable, and as lengthy as the ordeal they'd survived. When Rebecca and her children were first admitted to the hospital, the shock to their systems was profound. There were practical, immediate hurdles, doctors battling severe malnutrition, stunted growth, chronic infections, and untreated illnesses that had mapped themselves across their bodies. Specialists spent weeks stabilizing the children. Some faced neurological delays, others had vision issues caused by years in artificial light. Rebecca herself struggled with brittle bones, immune disorders, and poorly healed injuries. She needed months of medical interventions just to regain basic physical function. But for every step forward in their bodily recovery, the trauma of their ordeal lingered with a ferocity that confounded even seasoned psychologists. The children, each at different developmental junctures, displayed symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress, nightmares, hypersensitivity to noise, aversion to closed spaces, and moments of panic at ordinary household objects. Simple things, sunlight, unfiltered air, the sound of traffic, could spark either wonder or terror. Social workers assigned to the case grappled with how to introduce the rescued children to normalcy without overwhelming them. Urban landscapes seemed chaotic. Strangers' voices carried echoes of danger. Rebecca's road to healing was especially complicated. For nearly a quarter-century, her sense of self had been battered by isolation and gaslighting. Even as her physical wounds healed, the psychological injuries persisted in ways no one outside the trauma could entirely understand. A team of trauma therapists and psychiatrists worked with her on grounding techniques, helping her distinguish safe present from dangerous past. Sessions sometimes devolved into silence or tears as lost years and grief crowded in. Trust, even in well-meaning professionals, was not easily given. When she was most vulnerable, Rebecca oscillated between guilt, believing she was to blame for not escaping sooner, and the exhausted resolve to protect her children at all costs. The children, meanwhile, faced daunting adjustments. Their very identities required reconstruction. Some were given entirely new names, both for privacy and to sever links with their father's legacy. School was a foreign concept. Lessons, schedules, classmates, playground politics. Therapists initially shielded them from media attention, and even as news coverage of the case exploded, law enforcement maintained strict confidentiality about their lived experiences. Educational specialists created individualized learning programs. Some of the children advanced quickly, hungrily absorbing information and social cues. Others withdrew, skittish and irritable, overwhelmed by new rules and choices. In the beginning, even small steps were monumental victories, leaving a light on overnight without fear, making eye contact with a classmate, answering a question in school, or learning to voice a preference. For some, eating in front of others, asking for seconds, or falling asleep alone in a quiet room took months of gentle encouragement. Rebecca watched her children's progress with fear and pride, her maternal instincts sharpened by years underground but tested daily by the uncertainty of the outside world. The legal and bureaucratic aftermath was its own challenge. The state intervened to place the children and Rebecca in witness protection and specialized foster settings while their physical and psychological health stabilized. Rebecca, as their legal mother and primary survivor, had to undergo endless interviews and evaluations, sometimes feeling as if her life was being dissected anew by every new official or caseworker. The broader family, siblings who'd grown up above ground, distant relatives who'd assumed Rebecca dead, struggled with their own guilt, bewilderment, and anger. Some tried to reconnect, others could not face the agony and blame. Public fascination with the case never truly faded. Press coverage was relentless in the early months, journalists and armchair detectives unraveling details, speculating on overlooked warning signs, and sensationalizing the horrors. Rebecca's surviving children became, unwillingly, symbols in a national conversation about survivorhood, institutional failure, and the limits of empathy. Protective orders shielded their identities, but whispers and gossip sometimes found their way into schoolyards or local forums, compounding the isolation and making it difficult for them to simply start over. Therapy for all survivors became a lifeline and a maze. Trauma-informed counselors helped each child process memories at their own pace. Art, music, and movement therapies offered ways to express pain that words could not touch. Some children struggled with anger, at Daniel, at the world, and even at Rebecca, whose inability to save them sooner became a complicated source of resentment. Others clung almost desperately to their mother or older siblings, afraid of any new separation, even by a few feet. Emotional setbacks were common. Progress was measured in tiny increments, not milestones. With time, glimpses of resilience and hope began to emerge. One child became fascinated with drawing maps, perhaps an instinctive reclaiming of space and geography denied for so long. Another excelled in literature, writing essays about freedom, identity, and the simple pleasures of sunlight on skin. Rebecca, after months in therapy, enrolled in classes herself, determined to parent her children on her own terms and perhaps become an advocate for others like them. She spoke at events for survivors of abuse, lending her experience and a quiet, unflinching voice that resonated with listeners far beyond her town. Stigma, however, remained a shadow. There were people who reduced the family's story to headlines or Netflix documentaries, forgetting their everyday struggle simply to feel safe and whole. Some neighbors avoided the children out of discomfort. Others tried too hard to help, unintentionally triggering anxiety. The Miller house was eventually razed, the land seeded with wildflowers, an act of both erasure and new beginning. Yet for Rebecca and her children, true closure was elusive. Healing was not a destination but a lifelong journey, with moments of grace always ringed by memory's ache. Looking back now, the word aftermath feels inadequate for the magnitude of what Rebecca and her children endured and overcame. Their path forward was never linear, marked as much by setbacks and loss as by hard-won bright spots. There were tears, panic attacks, broken nights. There were quieter triumphs, laughter over shared meals, the comfort of running water, a day at the beach. The siblings forged a fierce solidarity, a bond forged in darkness that carried into light. Rebecca, battered but fiercely hopeful, became, unexpectedly, a symbol for survivors everywhere, proof that even the deepest wounds can seed new beginnings, imperfect but real. Their journey is a testament. Trauma echoes, rings out through generations, but with care, courage, and community, even the most brutal past does not have to define the future.